The old man sat quietly on the wooden bench in the park, his eyes following the children who ran across the grass. His clothes were simple, an old jacket, faded jeans, and a plain cap that shaded most of his face. People walked by without giving him more than a passing glance. To them, he was just another quiet elder spending his afternoon in silence. Nobody knew his story. Nobody imagined the life he once lived. He liked it that way, or at least that's what he told himself. He had served his country years ago in places where the air was thick with heat and fear. He had seen things no one back home could truly understand. He had marched under the sound of gunfire, carried brothers on his back, and stood in front of dangers that most people only read about in books. Yet when he came home, he wanted nothing more than peace. He never told anyone about what he had done, and he never showed the world what he carried with him. On his right arm, just under the sleeve of his jacket, there was a tattoo. The ink had faded with time, but the meaning behind it was still strong. It was not a common tattoo. It was not just an eagle flag or name. It was a special mark, one that only a few men in the world ever received. It was given after a mission no one talked about, a mission that changed the lives of everyone involved. But now, decades later, the tattoo was only a silent reminder to him. He believed no one would ever notice it again. Every day he followed the same quiet routine. He woke up early, brewed a simple cup of coffee, and took a slow walk to the park. Sometimes he would stop at the diner nearby, where the waitress always greeted him with a smile. She never asked about his past, only if he wanted eggs or toast. He liked that she treated him like a regular man, not a hero, not a soldier, just a man. After breakfast, he would return to the park and sit in the same spot, watching life move on without him. In the afternoons, the veteran sometimes visited the community center. The center often held events, youth sports, art fairs, and small concerts. He didn't speak much, but he enjoyed being surrounded by life. He liked hearing laughter, even if it wasn't his own. It reminded him that the world was still good, even after all the hard things he had seen. People often wondered about him. Some thought he might be lonely. Others thought he was just a man who enjoyed quiet. Nobody guessed that he carried medals in a box at home, medals he never displayed. Nobody guessed that he had once been in places far across the ocean, places most of them had never even seen on a map. He never talked about it because he didn't think it mattered anymore. To him, his service was in the past. What mattered now was the present, the sound of birds in the morning, the feel of warm sunlight on his face, the small greetings from neighbors who barely knew his name. But sometimes, late at night, he would roll up his sleeve and look at the tattoo. His fingers would trace the lines, and he would remember the faces of men he once knew. Some of them never made it home. Some of them still haunted his dreams. That tattoo was a reminder of a brotherhood, of loyalty, of a time when every breath was a fight to stay alive. He never thought anyone outside of that circle would recognize it. It was like a secret language, one only his old brothers would understand, and most of them were gone now. One evening, while sitting on his bench, he overheard a group of young men talking nearby. They were soldiers too, fresh from training, filled with energy and pride. They spoke about their drills, their long runs, their instructors who pushed them to their limits. The veteran listened quietly, a faint smile on his lips. He admired their spirit. He remembered when he was like them, young, fearless, ready to take on the world. He wanted to tell them that life would change, that battles would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. But he stayed silent. He believed his time for stories had passed. At that moment, his sleeve slipped just a little as he adjusted his cap. The edge of the tattoo peeked out, though he didn't notice. To him, it was just another ordinary day, another quiet moment among strangers. He didn't know that soon. Everything about his quiet life was about to change, because in that same community, there were also Navy SEALs visiting for an event. They were respected, strong, and admired by everyone around. People crowded to take photos with them, to thank them for their service. The veteran, as always, stayed to the side, watching from his bench. He felt no need to join in. In his mind, their world was different from his now. He was just an old man with fading memories, but fate has a strange way of reminding people of who they are. As one SEAL walked past, his sharp eyes caught something unusual. At first, he thought it was nothing more than an old tattoo. But as he looked closer, he froze. The mark on the veteran's arm wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. His training had told him about it. His instructors had spoken with respect about the men who wore it. To see it in real life on a quiet man sitting in the park was something he never imagined. The veteran, unaware, continued watching the children play. But the seal's heart was racing. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. That tattoo was not supposed to appear here, not on a stranger, not after all these years. The seal stood still, staring, unable to move for a moment. His breath caught and his mind filled with questions. Who was this man? Could it really be true? The old veteran shifted slightly, pulling his sleeve back over his arm. He remained calm as if nothing in the world had changed. He still believed no one would ever recognize him again. But he was wrong. His past had just stepped back into the present, and everything around him was about to shift. The stage was set for a meeting that would surprise everyone. Most of all, the man who thought he had been forgotten. The community center was filled with people that afternoon. Families had come to enjoy the small fair that was organized to honor veterans and active soldiers. Tables were lined with food, music played softly in the background, and groups of men and women in uniform stood proudly as civilians shook their hands and thanked them. The old veteran walked slowly to the back of the hall, quietly finding a seat near the wall. He liked watching people, but he always kept his distance. He never wanted to stand in the middle of the spotlight. He folded his hands on his lap and looked around. Children were running around with small flags in their hands. A choir of students was practicing a song for later. Soldiers in their sharp uniforms stood tall, their boots polished, their shoulders straight. The old veteran looked at them with a quiet smile. He remembered when he used to stand just like that, when he was young, filled with energy, his uniform pressed neatly and his heart full of courage. But those days were long gone now. The room grew louder as a group of Navy SEALs walked in. Their entrance brought a kind of excitement that spread quickly. People gathered near them, eager to take photos, eager to hear their stories. The SEALs greeted everyone politely, shaking hands, smiling, answering questions. The old veteran stayed where he was, blending into the background. He didn't feel the need to go forward. In his mind, these young men represented a new generation. His time had passed, and he had no desire to compete for attention. As he sat there, he adjusted his jacket. Without realizing it, his sleeve slipped up just enough to reveal the tattoo on his arm. The faded ink showed for a brief moment before he pulled the sleeve back down. To him, it was nothing. He thought no one in the room would know what it meant. But across the room, one SEAL had noticed. The SEAL had been greeting a small group of students when his eyes landed on the old man in the corner. At first, he only saw a quiet figure sitting alone. But then his attention shifted to the veteran's arm. His eyes widened and he froze. He had seen that tattoo before, but only in history books and training lessons. It wasn't the kind of mark anyone outside of a very secret circle would ever carry. The SEAL excused himself from the group and walked a little closer, his steps slow and careful. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His heart raced as he tried to understand. The stories from his training came back to him. The instructors had spoken of a legendary unit, men who had taken on missions so dangerous that few ever returned. They had called them ghosts, soldiers who fought in silence and disappeared without recognition. And those men carried a tattoo as their bond, a design so rare that even most soldiers had never seen it. Now, right before his eyes, that same tattoo was on the arm of an old man sitting quietly at a community event. The SEAL stopped a few feet away, staring. He tried to think of the right words to say, but none came out. The veteran noticed the man standing nearby and looked up, puzzled. He gave a small nod, the kind he gave to anyone passing by. But the SEAL didn't just nod back. His expression was one of shock, as if he had seen a ghost. The veteran tilted his head slightly, wondering why this young soldier looked at him that way. For years, nobody had paid attention to him. Nobody had asked him about his past. He had grown used to being invisible in crowds like this. But now, here was a Navy SEAL standing in front of him, frozen in place, his eyes locked on his arm. "Sir," the SEAL finally said, his voice low and unsteady. "Where did you get that tattoo?" The veteran's eyes narrowed slightly. He pulled his sleeve down again, covering the ink. His first instinct was silence. For decades, he had protected the secret, never once speaking about it outside his unit. He leaned back on his chair and gave a small shrug, as if the question didn't matter. But the SEAL didn't move away. His eyes were filled with respect mixed with disbelief. He lowered his voice so only the veteran could hear. "I was told only a handful of men in history ever carried that mark. My instructor. He said it belonged to heroes who shaped missions no one else could. Are you one of them? The old man looked away, his gaze falling on the children waving flags across the hall. He felt the memories rising in his chest, the sound of helicopters, the rush of water, the cries of brothers who didn't make it home. He swallowed hard. For so long he had locked those memories away, pretending they didn't exist. Now, with a single question, they were back. The SEAL waited patiently, standing tall but calm, his respect clear in every movement. The other SEALs in the room had noticed something unusual. They glanced at their teammate, then at the old man, wondering what was going on. Finally, the veteran let out a long breath. His voice was quiet but steady. That was a long time ago, son. Longer than you've been alive. It doesn't matter anymore. But the SEAL shook his head. It matters, he said firmly. Because men like me, we were trained by stories of men like you. They told us your missions kept entire units alive. They told us your sacrifices changed the course of battles. You may think nobody remembers, but we do. We've been carrying your legacy without ever knowing we'd meet you in person. The veteran's chest tightened. He hadn't expected such words. He had lived believing that his service was forgotten, buried under years of silence. To hear that the new generation of warriors still spoke of his unit, it stirred something deep inside him. For the first time in years, the old man felt seen. The SEAL slowly lowered himself, kneeling in front of the veteran so their eyes were level. It was not an act of weakness, it was an act of deep honor. The room had grown quieter now, as people noticed the unusual scene. A Navy SEAL, respected by everyone in the hall, was kneeling in front of a man most had thought was just an ordinary elder. Murmurs spread through the crowd as curiosity filled the air. The veteran shook his head gently, almost embarrassed. Stand up, son. You don't need to do that. But the SEAL's voice carried strength. Sir, you earned this. Long before I was even born, you earned this. The veteran's hands trembled slightly. His heart was heavy with memories, but also touched by the respect before him. He had thought his story would remain hidden forever, but now one soldier had seen through the silence. As the crowd leaned closer, whispers spread about the old man in the corner. Who was he? What did that tattoo mean? Why was a SEAL showing him such respect? The event that began as a simple gathering was turning into something far more important. The veteran, still unsure of what to do, looked at the young man kneeling before him and realized something. His past wasn't gone. His legacy wasn't erased. The mark on his arm was not just ink, it was history, and it had just been recognized by someone who understood its true meaning. The quiet life he had built was about to change. The air in the hall felt heavy as the Navy SEAL remained in front of the veteran, his eyes filled with awe and respect. People nearby began to notice the strange scene. They whispered to one another, wondering why one of the most respected young soldiers in the room had frozen in place before an old man sitting quietly against the wall. The veteran, still uncomfortable with all the attention, pulled his sleeve down once more to cover the tattoo. But it was too late. The moment had already shifted. The SEAL straightened slowly, his face serious. He didn't want to embarrass the veteran, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen. That tattoo was not something anyone could mistake. It was a piece of history, a mark of missions so dangerous and secret that most people never even learned they had happened. And here was a man who carried it, sitting quietly as if his life had been nothing extraordinary. The SEAL spoke clearly now, his voice strong enough for others to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, turning slightly toward the curious crowd, this man sitting before us is no ordinary veteran. The mark he carries, it belongs to one of the most legendary units our country has ever known. The hall grew quiet at once. Every eye turned toward the old man. He felt heat rise to his face. He never wanted attention, and certainly not like this. For decades he had lived quietly, away from the spotlight. But now the truth was no longer hidden. The veteran shook his head and muttered, That was a lifetime ago. I'm just an old man now. But the SEAL shook his head firmly. No, sir. You are a part of our history. The tattoo on your arm. It is the same one we were shown during training. We were told that only a small brotherhood carried it, and that brotherhood changed the course of missions others thought impossible. We were told that your courage still guides us even today. Gasps spread across the hall. People leaned closer, murmuring, their eyes wide with surprise. The young soldiers who had been bragging earlier fell silent, their pride fading into humility. They realized they were standing in the presence of someone who had done far more than they could imagine, The veteran's hands tightened around his cap. He wanted to stand and leave to escape the attention, but when he looked into the eyes of the SEAL, he saw no judgment, no mockery, only respect. For a long moment the veteran said nothing. His silence spoke volumes, and the people around him could feel the weight of history pressing into the room. Then slowly, he raised his head. His voice was steady, though soft. "That tattoo," he said, "was never meant to bring attention. It was meant to remind us of brothers we lost and of the sacrifices that were made. Most of those men never came home. I carry it not for myself, but for them." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. The SEAL nodded deeply. "And that is exactly why it matters. Because while most people may not know their names or their stories, we do. And today we are honored to meet you." The veteran's eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked the feeling away. He hadn't spoken of his past in years, not even to his closest neighbors. Yet now, standing before him was a soldier from a new generation, someone who had been trained on the legacy of his old unit. It was as if the past had found him again. One by one, other SEALs stepped closer. They looked at the old man with respect in their eyes, each one silently acknowledging the connection they felt. They didn't need him to tell the full story. They already knew enough to understand. To them, he was not just an old man in faded clothes. He was living history. The crowd began to clap softly, unsure at first, but then louder as more joined in. Soon the hall was filled with applause. Children waved their small flags toward him, and families looked at him with gratitude. The veteran lowered his head, humbled. He had never wanted recognition, but in that moment he realized that maybe it wasn't about him. It was about honoring the memory of all the men who never returned. The SEAL, still standing close, said gently, "Would you allow me, sir, to shake your hand?" The veteran hesitated, then slowly extended his trembling hand. Their grip was firm, strong, one filled with unspoken understanding. The crowd cheered louder. The veteran looked around, seeing faces filled with admiration. And for the first time in decades, he felt that his service had not been forgotten. But then something happened that made the moment even more powerful. The SEAL stepped back and raised his hand to his forehead in a sharp salute. The other SEALs followed immediately, their movements crisp and full of discipline. A dozen of the strongest warriors of the present day stood in perfect formation, saluting the man who had once walked the same hard road. The veteran's heart swelled. He did not stand, but he nodded slowly, acknowledging the salute. His voice, soft but clear, broke the silence. "Thank you. But remember, I'm just one man. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home." The SEALs lowered their hands but held their gaze on him. "And we remember them through you," one of them said firmly. The old man's throat tightened. He thought of the faces of his brothers, young men with laughter in their eyes who never got to grow old. For years he had carried the weight of their memory alone, but now, standing before him, was proof that the burden was shared, that their story had lived on in ways he never imagined. The younger soldiers in the hall stepped forward, asking shyly if they could shake his hand too. The veteran agreed, though each handshake left him both proud and humbled. The children in the room lined up as well, their small hands reaching out to him. Parents whispered to them, "Say thank you," and the children repeated the words with innocent sincerity. For the first time in so many years, the veteran felt warmth in his heart. He realized that the silence he had chosen was no longer necessary. His brother's sacrifices would not be forgotten, not as long as men like these SEALs carried the stories forward. The moment stretched on, unforgettable for everyone in the hall. The veteran had walked in believing he was invisible, but now he was the center of respect, honor, and gratitude. As the event began to close, the SEAL leaned closer once more and whispered, "Sir, we'd like to hear your story someday. Not for books, not for fame, but for us. Because men like me need to remember where we came from." The veteran gave a small smile, faint but genuine. "Maybe one day," he replied softly, and with that the hall erupted in applause once more, as if everyone understood that they had just witnessed a meeting between the past and the present, between a quiet legend and the soldiers he had unknowingly inspired. The veteran left the hall quietly that evening, but his steps felt lighter. He no longer felt invisible. He had been seen, recognized, and honored, not for glory, but for the quiet truth of sacrifice. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel proud. The night after the event, the veteran returned home slowly, his steps careful but lighter than usual. His small house was quiet, the kind of quiet he had grown used to over the years. He set his cap on the table and lowered himself into his chair by the window. For a long moment he sat without moving, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside. He felt different. For years he had walked among people like a shadow, unnoticed, unseen, but now suddenly the silence of his life felt broken. He rolled up his sleeve and looked again at the faded tattoo. He stared at it as if seeing it for the first time. His mind went back to the faces of his brothers, the ones who once wore the same mark. He remembered the fire in their eyes, their laughter in the middle of danger, the promises they made to watch each other's backs. He whispered their names quietly to himself, names no one else around him knew anymore. For the first time, he didn't feel alone with those memories. Someone else had recognized the mark. Someone else had spoken their legacy out loud. The next morning, word had already spread. People in the community center had told others about the moment when a Navy SEAL saluted an old veteran. They had described how the entire hall had gone silent, how respect filled the room, and how children had lined up to shake his hand. The story reached neighbors who had only known him as the quiet man who walked to the park each morning. Now they looked at him differently. When he passed by, they greeted him with more warmth, more curiosity, more admiration. At first, the veteran felt uneasy with the attention. He was not used to people asking questions about his past. For years, he had avoided those conversations. But now, something inside him told him that maybe the silence had lasted long enough. Maybe telling the truth would not only honor his brothers, but also inspire the younger generation who carried the flag today. Later that week, the SEAL returned to see him. He came not in uniform, but in plain clothes, walking quietly up the path to the veteran's house. He knocked gently, and when the veteran opened the door, he greeted him with respect, calling him sir again. The veteran chuckled softly. "I told you, son, I'm just an old man now. Come inside." They sat together in the small living room. The SEAL looked around, noticing the shelves were nearly bare. On one corner table sat a wooden box, worn with age. The veteran followed his gaze and gave a small nod. "That's where I keep the medals. I never displayed them. They don't belong on a wall. They belong with the memories." The SEAL leaned forward. "Sir, you may not realize it, but your story matters to men like us. We train hard, but we also carry the lessons of those who came before us. You may think your time is past, but for us, your time still speaks." The veteran stayed quiet for a moment, then slowly opened the box. Inside lay several medals, each one polished but hidden away for decades. He picked one up and held it in his palm, his fingers tracing its edges. "Each of these cost more than I can explain," he said quietly. "Not money, lives, sacrifices, nights where we didn't know if we'd see morning. I keep them to remember, not to be praised." The SEAL nodded, his respect growing deeper. "And that's why we salute you. Not because of what you kept, but because of what you gave." For the first time, the veteran began to share pieces of his story. He didn't give full details. Many parts were still too heavy, and some would remain forever untold. But he spoke of the brotherhood, the long nights, the missions where courage was the only thing keeping them together. The SEAL listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, his respect unshaken. By the time the story ended, the veteran leaned back in his chair, tired but lighter. It felt as if a weight he had carried alone for decades was now shared with someone else. The SEAL stood, shook his hand once more, and promised, "We will carry this forward. Your brothers will not be forgotten." Word of this quiet meeting spread too, though neither of them had spoken about it publicly. People in the community continued to whisper about the old man who had once been a silent figure, but was now known as a living legend. Neighbors came by more often, some bringing food, others simply sitting on the porch with him, asking gentle questions about his service. Children stopped when they saw him, waving their little flags with wide smiles. The veteran did not seek fame. He did not want to be treated like a celebrity, but he realized that something powerful was happening. His story was giving people a lesson about respect, sacrifice, and gratitude. Families talked to their children about him. Young soldiers listened with humility. The man who once thought he was invisible was now seen as a symbol of strength, humility, and quiet pride. One afternoon, the SEAL returned again, this time with a small group of his teammates. They came not for ceremony, but for companionship. They sat with the veteran on his porch, listening as he spoke softly about leadership, about staying strong for one another, about never leaving a brother behind. The SEALs nodded, taking his words as if they were gold. For them, it was not just advice, it was history alive, spoken from someone who had lived it. The veteran looked around at the young men sitting before him, and his heart felt something he hadn't felt in decades: belonging. For so long, he had lived as if his life was separate from the world, but now he felt connected again. The new generation of warriors had opened a door he thought was closed forever. As the sun set that evening, the SEALs stood to leave. Before they went, they formed a line once more, each giving him a firm handshake and a salute. The veteran, his voice low but filled with strength, said, "Take care of each other. That's the only way you'll make it through." They promised they would. And with that, they left, leaving the veteran with a new sense of peace. That night, as he sat by his window again, he realized something important. He had once thought his tattoo was just a silent memory, a private reminder of a past that no one cared about anymore. But now he saw that it was more than that. It was a bridge between generations. It was proof that courage and sacrifice did not vanish with time. They lived on, carried by those who recognized it. For the first time in years, the veteran felt proud to carry the tattoo. Not for himself, but for the brothers it represented, and the younger soldiers it continued to inspire. The quiet man who had thought no one would ever recognize him had become a beacon of respect, and his story was no longer hidden. The past had returned, but not as a burden. It had returned as a gift. The following weeks felt different for the veteran. Every morning when he walked to the park, people greeted him with more warmth. The waitress at the diner, who once only asked about eggs and toast, now smiled with a sparkle in her eyes, saying, "Good morning, hero." Children who played nearby waved to him as if he were someone special. At first, it made him uncomfortable. He had never seen himself as anything more than a man who had done his duty. But slowly he realized this change was not about him. It was about what he represented. One day, as he sat on his usual bench, he noticed a father pointing him out to his son. The boy, no more than 10 years old, looked shy at first, but his father encouraged him to walk closer. The boy stopped in front of the veteran, holding a small flag in his hand. "Thank you," the boy said softly. The veteran's heart tightened. He had been thanked many times in the past weeks, but this one felt different. It was pure, honest, and full of innocence. He reached out and shook the boy's hand, smiling gently. "You're welcome, son. Remember, freedom is something many gave their lives for. Treat it kindly." Moments like these began to multiply. The veteran's quiet life was no longer invisible. People invited him to small gatherings, asked him to share stories, and even requested that he speak at the community center. At first, he refused. He didn't believe he had the strength to stand before a crowd and talk about the past. But the SEALs who had visited him encouraged him gently. "Your words don't have to be about war," one of them said. "They just need to be about life. People need to hear what you carry." At last he agreed. The community center filled with families, soldiers, and children eager to listen. He walked to the small stage slowly, his back slightly bent but his presence strong. At first he didn't know what to say. He looked out at the sea of faces waiting for him. Then he simply began. "I never wanted to be seen as different," he said, his voice steady. "I wanted to live quietly because my memories were heavy. But then I realized something. Silence keeps stories hidden, and if stories are hidden, so are the lessons." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. "I carry a tattoo," he continued, pulling up his sleeve slightly to reveal the faded ink. "It does not make me special. It makes me a reminder of men who were braver than me, who gave more than I did, who never came home. I wear it for them, not for myself." He paused, his eyes glistening. "When you see someone in uniform, thank them. When you see someone struggling, remember they might carry invisible battles. And when you live your life in peace, remember it did not come without cost. If you remember those things, then the sacrifices of my brothers will never be forgotten." The room erupted into applause, but it wasn't loud or rowdy. It was steady, respectful, and filled with emotion. People rose to their feet, giving him the honor he had never asked for but truly deserved. The veteran lowered his sleeve again and bowed his head slightly. He had not told everything. Many details would stay locked in his heart, but he had said enough. After the event, people approached him one by one. Some asked questions, some simply thanked him, and others shared their own family stories of service. He listened patiently to each one. The SEAL who had first recognized his tattoo stood nearby, smiling quietly. He knew this was the beginning of something bigger than just a recognition. It was the passing of a legacy. In the days that followed, the veteran noticed how his story began to spread beyond the community. Local newspapers wrote about him. Photos of the salute from the SEAL appeared online, shared by people who admired the moment. Letters began to arrive at his small house, some from strangers who had read about him, others from old comrades who had lost touch. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, came from a man who had served in a nearby unit during the same war. "I thought everyone had forgotten us," the letter read, "but seeing your story gave me hope again." The veteran held that letter to his chest for a long time. For decades, he thought he had been carrying the weight alone. Now he realized there were countless others who shared his journey in silence, each waiting for someone to break the quiet. One evening, the SEAL returned once more, this time alone. He sat beside the veteran on the porch, and for a while they said nothing, just watching the sun sink behind the horizon. Finally, the SEAL spoke. "Sir, you've given us more than you realize." "We live by your lessons now," the veteran chuckled softly. "I've only given words, son. You're the ones carrying the burden now." The SEAL shook his head. "No, you gave us a path. That tattoo, it isn't just ink. It's a symbol of what we must strive to be, brave, loyal, unshaken." The old man nodded slowly. "Then carry it well. That's all I ask." The bond between them had grown deep, almost like family. The SEAL often visited him, sometimes bringing his teammates, sometimes just himself. They shared meals, stories, and moments of quiet respect. The veteran, once alone in his silence, now felt surrounded by brothers again, even if they belonged to a different generation. One bright morning, the veteran walked through the park once more. He passed by families enjoying picnics, children playing, and young soldiers jogging. As he moved, people waved. Some even saluted him with smiles. He returned the greetings with nods and small smiles of his own. He no longer felt invisible. He no longer felt forgotten. He sat on his usual bench, adjusting his sleeve. For once, he let the tattoo show without pulling the fabric back down. He wasn't ashamed of it anymore. He wasn't afraid it would draw unwanted attention. Instead, he let it be seen, knowing now that recognition was not about him but about everyone it represented. A small group of children ran past him laughing, and one of them stopped, pointing at the mark. "What's that, mister?" the child asked with curiosity. The veteran smiled warmly. "That," he said softly, "is a promise. A promise to always remember the ones who gave everything." The child nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the importance. He ran off to join his friends, leaving the veteran smiling to himself. As the day stretched on, the veteran leaned back and closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He thought about his brothers, about the SEAL who had recognized him, about the community that now embraced him. For the first time in so many years, his heart felt light. He realized something powerful in that moment. He had thought his story was over. He had believed no one would ever remember the man he once was, or the men he had once stood beside. But he had been wrong. His story lived on, not in medals, not in books, but in the hearts of those who now carried it forward. The black veteran who once thought no one would recognize him had finally discovered that legacy cannot be hidden. It waits patiently until the right moment when the right eyes see it, and then it shines brighter than ever. And so, he sat with peace in his heart, knowing the truth. He was never forgotten. He was always remembered, even when he didn't know it. His brothers lived through him, through the mark on his arm, through the salute of a SEAL, and through the gratitude of a community. The quiet man had become a living reminder of courage, and his story, once silent, would now echo for generations to come.